What's up, guys? Trevor here. Bigfoot has been part of campfire stories and local legends for decades, but some sightings are far more disturbing than others. The cases you're about to hear go beyond blurry photos and distant shapes in the woods. They involve terrifying encounters that left witnesses shaken for years. Join me as we dive into the scariest Bigfoot sightings ever recorded. On June 15, 2015, a mother from Oklahoma called 911, her house torn apart. Doors splintered, massive handprints gouged into the siding, and her daughter attacked. What followed would be one of the most disputed Bigfoot-related disappearances ever on reservation land. Anita Graywolf, 39, was a social worker from Tulsa who had spent most of her life listening to other people's stories and learning how to separate fear from fact. After years in the city, she decided to return with her daughter, Maya, to the family property on the southeastern border of the Cherokee Reservation, a place her grandparents had once warned her never to disturb. For Anita, the move felt like both an escape and a responsibility, to remind her daughter where she came from, unaware that the valley they were returning to had been waiting for them. The land sat beside Hollow Valley, a stretch of forest that Anita remembered only through half-forgotten warnings from her grandparents. The stories she said she knew had always been about the Stone Man, a guardian spirit said to rise when people disturbed the balance of the old ground. Anita had once laughed at those tales. Now, standing in the quiet clearing, she found herself uneasy at how easily the valley swallowed sound. She said that when she announced her plans to stay for the summer, the tribal elders' concern unsettled her more than she admitted. They told her the Stone Man walks when people forget him, and that Hollow Valley remembers what was taken from it. She wanted to believe their tone was ceremonial, but there was something in their eyes that lingered after the conversation ended. She later learned their worry had roots in the past. In the 1950s, a limestone quarry had been cut directly into ground, once used for Cherokee burials and ceremonies. The elders said the land had never settled after that. But was it merely a story meant to preserve respect, or a warning too old to be ignored? Her skepticism would have felt firmer if she had known nothing of the missing person cases that surrounded the valley. For decades, rumors had circulated about disappearances quietly erased from tribal police files. The idea sounded impossible, but something about that absence, what wasn't on paper, bothered her. Why were those records erased? And by whom? By the time she and Maya arrived in early June 2015, Anita said that she was determined to treat the trip as a family experiment rather than a spiritual one. She had no reason to think the valley would challenge her sense of what was real. Maya, eager for a project, began recording interviews with elders for what she called a folklore study. Anita mentioned to investigators that she encouraged it, proud of her daughter's initiative. The drawings Maya made afterward, tall figures covered in moss with eyes like polished stone, struck Anita as creative exaggerations. So why did Maya's drawings start to match what others had described decades earlier? When Maya reviewed her recordings, she mentioned a faint pulsing sound that repeated through every clip filmed near the tree line. Anita assumed it was interference, maybe a faulty microphone. Later analysis by others would suggest the frequencies resembled those produced by large mammals, but at the time, Anita dismissed it without hesitation. The first thing she couldn't dismiss came from the dogs. They refused to cross the clearing that bordered the forest, bracing their legs and whining whenever she tried to lead them forward. Even food couldn't persuade them. Their bodies went rigid, muscles trembling, eyes fixed on the dark edge of the trees, as though something waited just beyond sight. Anita compared this animal reaction to what she had seen in trauma survivors: instinctive, unreasoned, absolute. She wrote it off at first as a remnant of travel stress, but over the next 2 days, the dogs grew worse, pacing the porch at night and refusing to leave the steps, even to relieve themselves. On June 8th, she and Maya began hearing slow, deliberate impacts from the direction of the valley. 3 strikes, always in sequence, then silence. The sound was heavy, like wood on wet earth, each blow separated by an unnatural stillness. Anita kept count in a small notebook, treating each sound like a case note. noting the intervals and time of day. Sometimes the noises came after dusk, other times at dawn when the air was completely still. She wondered if stress or isolation had made her hypersensitive to noise, but the dogs would react first, heads lifting moments before she heard it. 4 days later, Maya filmed a short interview with her on the porch, a casual talk about family heritage and why they'd returned. The atmosphere felt peaceful, though Anita noticed the quiet had changed in a subtle way, the absence of birds, the stillness of leaves. She remembered the light that afternoon, bright, steady, the woods behind her unmoving in the heat. Maya had laughed easily, asking about old stories their grandmother used to tell. Everything about that hour seemed ordinary until later that night, when Maya replayed the footage. When she did, she froze. At the 18-minute mark, behind where Anita had been sitting, a tall figure stood between the trees. It did not move. The shape was dark, featureless but clearly solid, the upper outline distinct against the lighter canopy. Anita thought it might have been a shadow at first, some play of light through shifting branches, but the figure remained fixed while the camera trembled slightly in Maya's hands. Frame-by-frame review showed it remained visible for nearly 4 minutes before vanishing between one frame and the next. By tree measurements, it stood more than 8 feet tall. Its limbs appeared long, almost disproportionate, the posture too upright for a bear and too broad for a man. Anita watched the footage twice, then a third time, unable to decide whether she was seeing a trick of light or the shape the elders had warned about. The one said to appear first at a distance, always watching, never retreating. She turned off the laptop and told Maya to delete the file, but by then it had already been copied to her phone. The question that lingered after the screen went dark wasn't what it was. Investigators later asked, how does something that large vanish in a single frame? According to reports, word of Maya's footage spread quickly through the tribal community, reaching Anita before she was ready to face the attention it brought. 2 Cherokee police officers arrived the next afternoon, requesting copies of the recording. Anita watched them move methodically through the property, examining the area where the figure had stood. They pointed to the impressions in the soft earth near the tree line, indentations she had stepped around for days without realizing their significance. Plaster casts were made of several 16-inch footprints that revealed a strange, asymmetrical gait. Anita noticed how the impressions sank deeply at both heel and toe, suggesting something heavy yet balanced, as though whatever made them could move with its full weight upright. The stride between each print measured nearly 4 feet. To her, it looked like a pattern that belonged to neither man nor bear, but something that walked like both. Despite the documentation, the casts were gone within days. Anita learned that wildlife management had taken possession of them, though she did say that she never saw any paperwork confirming that transfer. When she later asked for the case number, the files had already disappeared from the record. What remained were Maya's photographs, the only proof that the prints had existed at all. That night, the rhythmic knocking resumed. Anita marked 3 distinct impacts in her notebook, followed by a deep, dragging exhalation that seemed to press through the bedroom wall. It was the first time she admitted to herself that she was frightened, though she forced her mind to frame it as data. Something to be cataloged, not feared. The disturbances were escalating. Anita felt a growing certainty that their arrival had disrupted something old and watchful, something that had waited for acknowledgement. The Stone Man legend was no longer folklore whispered by elders. It was pressing against her reality. By the second week of June, the property had taken on the atmosphere of a siege. The nighttime sounds followed a strict schedule, every night between 2:45 and 3:10. Anita said that she would wake to 3 heavy knocks from different sides of the house, then silence, then guttural calls that vibrated through the walls with physical force. She documented each sequence, her digital recorder filling with data she could neither explain nor dismiss. When wildlife officers arrived to analyze the recordings, their report only deepened her confusion. The sounds matched no known species in the region and registered at decibel levels, suggesting immense lung capacity. One officer remarked that the calls appeared to be directed toward the Gray Wolf residence, as if in response to something within it. Anita replayed that observation in her head for nights afterward, wondering if something in the valley recognized them specifically. But if it wanted contact, why did it never approach openly? Alongside the sounds came an odor so pungent it seemed alive, a mixture of wet earth and decomposition that saturated the air and vanished at sunrise. Anita noted its presence during every nocturnal disturbance. Maya, increasingly distressed, began sleeping with towels under her door to block the smell, complaining that it caused nausea and headaches. On June 12th, Anita told investigators that she found the chicken coop destroyed at dawn. The wooden frame had collapsed inward, boards splintered, but unmarked by claw or bite. There were no tracks in the surrounding dirt, no drag signs, no sign of struggle. The chain-link fencing had been crushed from above as if something immense had dropped onto it. The force required to break the wooden posts at ground level seemed beyond any natural animal. Yet the scene bore no mechanical evidence, no tire marks, no tool impressions. The 6 chickens lay arranged in a straight line 20 feet from the coop. Each neck was broken cleanly, the bodies otherwise untouched. Anita stood over them for several minutes, struck by the absence of chaos. Whatever had done this, it had acted with purpose. 3 days later, during a survey of the property line, she noticed several mature oaks near the abandoned quarry, stripped of bark in clean vertical lines reaching 8 feet up the trunks. The sap was still fresh. When forestry officials inspected the damage, they found no evidence of tools. The bark had been removed in single, fluid motions that implied immense leverage or precision. Reports from nearby ranchers followed the next morning. Deer carcasses had begun appearing in semicircular patterns across the valley, all facing the forest. Anita noted how consistent the arrangement sounded, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The animals showed no sign of disease or predation, their bodies unmarked and intact. Veterinary exams revealed no physiological cause of death. The symmetry of it unsettled her more than the images themselves. Who or what had arranged them with such deliberate symmetry? Technological interference intensified as the pattern continued. Trail cameras deployed by wildlife officers failed within a day, their storage cards corrupted or blank. One managed to capture 6 seconds of usable footage before malfunctioning. When Anita reviewed the clip at the tribal office, she saw a massive silhouette pass close to the lens, so near that the frame blurred from motion. The shape filled the entire shot, yet no features could be discerned. Watching it, she felt the same weight in her chest she had felt that first night, the sense that something vast was studying them in return. The silhouette footage became a point of fixation for researchers, but for Anita, it was something far worse, a confirmation that what had been circling their property had form and intent. Frame-by-frame analyses circulated among cryptozoology circles, showing what appeared to be a bipedal figure of immense proportion with an unnatural gait. She watched those frames repeatedly, noting how the creature seemed to pause and turn toward the camera before the image collapsed into static, as though it had known it was being observed. Anita's documentation changed with that realization. Her once clinical notes, precise and organized, began to unravel into chaotic bursts of handwriting. The early entries were still careful: times, durations, temperature readings, notes about light and sound direction. By mid-June, her writing had become fragmented and urgent, whole lines underlined in heavy strokes, some entries reduced to single declarative phrases written in all capitals, the handwriting trembling with exhaustion and dread. The entry, dated June 14th, stood out most starkly in her own recollection. "It knows we're watching. The sounds are getting closer." Maya drew another picture. Today, how does she know what it looks like? She had not intended to write in that tone, but by then she said that her thoughts had ceased to feel like her own. Maya's sketches were growing disturbingly detailed. Anita noticed the anatomical precision in her daughter's depictions. The elongated limbs, the vast chest, the strange curvature of the shoulders. The eyes in the drawings seemed to hold the page, pale and deliberate, as if some shared vision had guided the pencil. Maya had never seen the creature directly, yet her renderings captured something that made Anita's stomach tighten whenever she looked too long. Anita began to believe the creature was asserting itself, responding to their presence. It moved with deliberation, leaving signs and signals that felt territorial. The Gray Wolf property had become the center of a confrontation decades in the making, and Anita sensed they were now a part of whatever unfinished pattern the valley had been holding. By June 13th, the boundary between observation and participation had dissolved completely. They were no longer witnesses. They were being engaged. The rhythmic pounding that had once seemed distant now shook the entire structure, causing light fixtures to sway and glass to hum in the window panes. Electrical power failed in unison with the pounding, as though each impact drained the air and current at once. The darkness that followed was total, broken only by the pulse of sound surrounding the house in coordinated patterns. But how could something that large perform those without leaving tracks? Her skepticism collapsed quietly rather than dramatically. She now slept on the couch facing the entryway, a claw hammer resting beside her. She positioned herself between the door and Maya's room, sleeping only in short intervals, ears trained on every shift in the wind. Each thud outside felt calculated, as if the thing circling them was not just testing boundaries, but studying them. Maya changed with the pattern of nights. She spoke less, drew more. Her notebooks filled with sequences of the same towering figure, sometimes at the edge of the woods, sometimes half obscured by branches, always turned toward the house. Her focus became unnervingly precise. She would stay awake for hours sketching in silence, her pencil tracing shapes Anita could almost hear. When the wildlife biologists arrived, Anita's hope returned for the first time in weeks. A 3-person team from the Department of Conservation, led by Dr. Ellis Crane, set up on her porch, their confidence measured and professional. Maya recorded the session for her project, while Anita presented her notes, her tone steady as she explained each incident. The destroyed coop, the stripped trees, the symmetrical animal carcasses. She placed her journal before them, offering data she had spent sleepless nights compiling, hoping science might impose structure on the chaos. The scientists' response struck her harder than the knocking ever had. Their calm detachment felt rehearsed. Dr. Crane mentioned isolation hysteria, describing how sensory deprivation could distort perception. His colleague, Dr. Leora Vance, spoke of bacterial infections and environmental contamination, though she admitted that all samples tested clean. Their dismissal of the electromagnetic failures drew the faintest smile from Crane, as though the notion itself insulted his expertise. To Anita, the condescension felt colder than disbelief. That night, their team established a base camp half a mile from the Gray Wolf house. Anita watched their lights fade behind the trees, the equipment glinting under the beam of their headlamps. Motion sensors, infrared rigs, field recorders, electromagnetic detectors arranged with precision and purpose. They moved with the confidence of people who still believed the world was explainable. At 2:30 in the morning, Anita awoke to the sound of static from her handheld radio, followed by a burst of overlapping transmissions. The interference grew dense, layered with low-frequency vibrations that made the walls tremble. Later reports confirmed that the biologists' instruments had all triggered at once: motion sensors, EMF readers, and infrared cameras detecting massive simultaneous movement within a 200-yard radius. The last thing Anita heard before the transmission died was Dr. Crane's voice, distorted by interference, describing something enormous moving between their tents. The signal dissolved into a roar of white noise, leaving the radio silent in her hands. At dawn, tribal police and emergency teams reached the scientists' camp. Anita saw the overturned field truck before they did, half sunk into the clearing. The vehicle had been flipped onto its roof, the frame collapsed inward as though pressed by unimaginable weight. The metal bore deep, rounded impressions, marks that no known tool or natural event could explain. Standing in the wreckage's shadow, Anita understood that whatever had come for them was still nearby, and that its interest had not faded with the night. The three biologists were found unconscious but uninjured approximately 100 yards from their destroyed vehicle. Anita never saw the moment they were discovered, only the aftermath, their faces pale under the emergency floodlights, their movements sluggish and uncertain. They had been lucky, she thought, though none of them looked it. All three suffered from mild hypothermia and temporary memory loss, unable to recall anything beyond the stroke of midnight. Their expensive scientific equipment was strewn across the forest like discarded bones, some pieces embedded in tree trunks 20 feet above ground, as if thrown there by impossible force. Dr. Crane's infrared camera, retrieved by deputies, had captured 47 seconds before dying. Anita watched the playback on a deputy's tablet, numb as the thermal image revealed a towering bipedal shape crossing the campsite at 1:11 in the morning. 8, maybe 9 feet tall. Its heat signature fluctuated strangely, pulsing in uneven waves that no one could explain. She thought of the rhythmic knocking on her own walls, of the heavy breath she sometimes swore she could feel through the floorboards. The creature's heat map glowed and then vanished, replaced by static. Dr. Crane refused to return to Hollow Valley afterward. Anita read his report days later, a single sterile paragraph recommending that the area be closed to researchers. No one mentioned what else might live there. The silence that followed was worse than ridicule. It was abandonment. Back at the Grey Wolf house, the fallout from the scientists' retreat pressed down like a physical weight. Anita understood finally that no one would help them. The decision to leave was immediate, but Maya's plea for one more day, just one more recording, cut deep. She said she was close to proving it existed. Anita had no words left to argue. Against everything maternal in her, she agreed to stay. That night, the smell grew unbearable. It wasn't rot anymore, but something acidic, almost manufactured, seeping through the walls until their eyes burned. Anita sealed every window, dragged furniture against the doors, and refused to step outside. Even the dogs seemed hollowed out, lying together in silence, their ribs trembling with each breath. The air inside the house felt heavy, charged with the same pressure that came before lightning. She could feel it watching, waiting. By June 15th, the valley had turned hostile. Weather alerts warned of severe electrical storms and potential tornadic activity, but Anita barely heard them. She spent the day packing methodically, forcing her hands to move even as static hissed through every device. Radios spat nonsense, cell signals dissolved into bursts of interference. The air smelled of metal. When the storm hit at 9:37, it sounded like the sky tearing apart. Lightning strobed through the windows, each flash revealing the motionless dogs, the trembling curtains, the outline of the forest beyond. At 9:47, the grid failed. Darkness swallowed the property. Then came the knocking, not the scattered taps of previous nights, but a full assault, measured, powerful, deliberate. The house shuddered as though gripped by unseen hands. Anita felt the floor flex beneath her feet, dishes clattering from shelves, window panes vibrating in rhythm. Somewhere deep inside the structure, something answered each strike with a groan of wood under strain. She grabbed the phone, fighting static, her voice barely rising above the noise. The dispatcher would later note the time, 9:47 and 32 seconds, and the garbled fragments of what she said. The connection pulsed with distortion, each syllable smeared by interference. Anita remembered hearing movement in Maya's room and a heavy step outside, close, circling. The power surged once, flickered, and died. Then that freight train sound roared overhead, a force of wind or something else pressing against the walls. She tried again to speak. The voice that emerged didn't sound like hers. She said something was shaking the house, that Maya was inside, that it was here. The call ended abruptly. Dispatch marked it at 9:49 and 4 seconds, when lightning hit the ridge, blinding white and final. By the time rescuers arrived after midnight, the storm had broken. The door hung open, rain sweeping through the rooms. Furniture lay overturned, glass scattered like salt. Anita's awareness of that night would later fracture into fragments. The smell of ozone, the static still humming in her teeth, and the silence that followed. Outside, they found the tracks, Maya's small footprints running from the porch into the woods, pressed deep into the mud, as though each step had been forced by something close behind. The stride length made no sense for a child. Anita would replay that image forever, those tiny prints vanishing into the trees, chased by something that left only enormous symmetrical impressions on the earth. The search dogs refused to follow. They approached the ridge, then froze, whining and trembling until their handlers dragged them back. Whatever waited beyond that line, even the animals understood they were not meant to cross. The trail ended at a rocky outcropping half a mile from the house, and Anita knew the search was over long before anyone said it. Maya's footprints simply stopped, pressed deep into the soft earth, and then gone, as if the ground itself had swallowed her. There were no signs of a fall, no scuff marks, no drag lines. The larger impressions, the ones that followed, continued for another 50 yards before vanishing on hard stone. She studied the ground until her vision blurred, unable to understand how something that heavy could stop leaving tracks. The official search expanded quickly after that. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating over the valley, while search teams spread through the forest with bright vests and radios that crackled through static. 50 volunteers joined in, calling her daughter's name over and over into the trees. The sound echoed strangely, as if the valley itself refused to return it. For 6 days they searched, through rising heat, rain, and the chemical smell that seemed to linger even after the storm passed. No one found a single trace of Maya beyond that ridge. When the state officials arrived with their reports and explanations, their words barely registered. They said the storm had caused disorientation. They said the terrain was dangerous and that Maya must have fallen somewhere unseen. Anita listened but felt detached from everything, like the conversation was taking place in another room. On June 21, 2015, the search was officially ended. The paperwork said, "Death by misadventure," but Anita could still smell the sour electricity in the air and the damp soil where the prints had stopped. After the searchers left, the silence of Hollow Valley grew unbearable. Anita stayed behind, unable to leave the ridge where the trail ended. She built a small camp from what remained of their supplies, a plastic tarp and the remnants of the storm shelter. Locals later said they saw her wandering at dawn, moving quietly among the trees, keeping watch as if waiting for something to return. She marked each passing night by the sound of distant knocking that no one else seemed to hear. The cold didn't matter. The hunger didn't matter. The ridge had become the last place her daughter existed, and she couldn't abandon it. 3 weeks later, she was found by a county patrol officer, dehydrated and barely conscious. They said she resisted evacuation, insisting she needed to stay where the ground broke off. She was transported to Eastern State Hospital in Veneta, placed under observation in a quiet ward with sealed windows and soft lighting. Investigators visited her frequently in those first days, hoping to piece together what had happened in the woods, but her answers only deepened their confusion. The diagnosis was written in careful medical language, acute stress reaction with psychotic features, but the doctors never understood what she had seen or what she was still listening for at night when she refused to sleep. 5 years passed before anyone found anything tangible. In the summer of 2020, hikers moving through an unmarked section of Hollow Valley discovered skeletal remains scattered near a dry creek bed, over a mile from where the original search had ended. The bones were light, almost bleached by time, and the earth around them had hardened into pale clay. DNA confirmed what Anita had already known since the night of the storm. The remains belonged to Maya Graywolf. The announcement brought no comfort, only the final confirmation that the valley had taken her child and then returned her as proof. The official record lists the case as unresolved, death by misadventure, circumstances undetermined. The language is cautious, bureaucratic, meant to close a file. But the evidence remains. Those impossible tracks, the magnetic interference, the shape burned into a camera's memory. In Anita's mind, the valley still breathes. What happened there was never meant to be explained by the kind of people who write reports. On October 13, 2023, Emma Rodriguez had been in the Olympic National Forest for only 3 hours when she first heard the sound that would haunt her nightmares forever. The low, resonant call seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet and echoing from the trees themselves. She froze on the trail, her heart pounding as the sound repeated, too deep and too complex to be produced by any known animal, yet carrying an unmistakable intelligence that suggested communication rather than simple vocalization. The forest around her had fallen completely silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath in terror of what had just announced its presence. Emma's camera equipment began malfunctioning the moment she tried to record the strange vocalizations, her devices shutting down at seemingly random intervals, despite having functioned perfectly just minutes before. Her GPS readings showed impossible coordinates that placed her in locations that didn't exist on any map, while her compass spun wildly as if something was actively interfering with her technology. The silence that followed the creature's call was so complete, it seemed to press against her eardrums like a living thing, broken only by the sound of her own panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her trembling feet. But beneath that silence, Emma began to detect something else, the almost imperceptible sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth with impossible stealth. When Emma finally worked up the courage to continue down the trail, she discovered massive footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, prints that measured nearly 18 inches in length and showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs. The tracks formed a deliberate pattern around the area where she'd been standing, as if something had been circling her position while she remained frozen in terror. Most disturbing was the realization that whatever had made these prints had approached to within mere feet of where she stood, close enough to touch her. Yet she had never seen or heard its approach through the dense undergrowth. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed over 600 pounds, moving with a grace that defied its massive size. Emma's attempts to leave the area were immediately frustrated by obstacles that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. Fallen trees blocked the trail she'd used to enter the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural occurrence. Her satellite phone produced only static and interference that seemed to intensify whenever she tried to call for help, as if something was actively jamming her communications to prevent her from sharing her discoveries with the outside world. The isolation that had seemed appealing when she'd planned this expedition now felt like a trap, with Emma beginning to realize that she was no longer the observer in this situation, but rather the observed. Every step she took seemed to be anticipated, every route she chose blocked by obstacles that appeared too convenient to be natural. The first direct sighting came as Emma struggled to find an alternate route through the dense forest, her panic growing with each blocked path and dead end. Through the trees ahead, she caught a glimpse of something enormous moving between the massive trunks with impossible stealth, a figure that stood upright like a human but possessed proportions that suggested a creature of incredible size and strength. The being seemed to be studying her from a distance, its movements coordinated and purposeful as it paralleled her desperate attempts to escape. When Emma tried to focus her camera on the creature, the device immediately shut down, leaving her with only the terrifying memory of eyes that reflected the filtered sunlight with unmistakable intelligence, and what appeared to be curiosity about her presence in its domain. Emma's terror escalated when she realized that the creature was not alone. Sounds of movement from multiple directions indicated that she was surrounded by several large beings that were coordinating their activities with a precision that suggested advanced communication abilities. The forest itself seemed to be working against her escape, with branches that caught at her clothing in ways that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, and roots that appeared to shift position to trip her at crucial moments. Her attempts to document what was happening were frustrated by equipment failures that occurred at the most crucial moments, as if whatever was watching her understood the importance of preventing her from gathering evidence of their existence. The creatures seemed to possess an understanding of human technology that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Emma's frantic escape became a blur of terror as the forest closed in around her. The deeper she ran, the more the landscape twisted. Paths vanished, landmarks shifted, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and something musky. Every time she paused, she could hear the creatures moving just out of sight, their footfalls muffled, guttural calls echoing like a language meant for the trees. At one point, Emma tumbled down a slope into a shallow creek. The water was icy, shocking her back to her senses. She scrambled up, only to see a massive shadow pass silently along the ridge above. The creature paused, its silhouette framed by moonlight, and Emma felt its gaze settle on her like a physical weight. She pressed herself against the bank, barely daring to breathe, as the being let out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through her bones. The chase resumed, but now the creatures were driving her, not just following, but steering her with uncanny precision. Whenever she tried to double back or hide, a branch would snap or a stone would be thrown, forcing her to change direction. She caught glimpses of more than one figure moving in parallel, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their movements impossibly fast and coordinated. Emma realized with dread that she was being herded toward a destination she could neither see nor understand. Suddenly, the forest opened into a wide, unnatural clearing. The ground was covered in spirals of stones and bones, and the trees around the perimeter were marked with deep gouges and strange symbols. The air was thick with anticipation, and Emma felt as if she had stepped into the center of some ancient ritual. The largest creature emerged from the shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing, its breath steaming in the cold night air. It raised its arms and let out a series of calls, each one answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground tremble. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A test? The creatures circled the clearing, their eyes never leaving her, their movements deliberate and measured. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and warp, the world narrowing to the circle of stones and the silent, watching eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The creatures melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone and trembling in the center of the clearing. She didn't wait to see if they would return. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, Emma fled into the darkness. The memory of the ritual burned into her mind. Even as she ran, she knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only a glimpse of a mystery that would never let her go. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance began to manifest in ways that Emma struggled to understand or control. She found herself anticipating the movements of her unseen watchers, adjusting her path to avoid areas where she sensed their presence, while simultaneously being herded along routes that led deeper into their territory. The creatures seemed to be learning from their observations of her behavior, adapting their tactics based on her responses, and becoming more sophisticated in their approach with each passing hour. Emma began to feel like a laboratory animal being studied by researchers whose intelligence far exceeded her own, trapped in an experiment whose purpose she couldn't begin to understand. The realization that she was being manipulated by something that could think and plan was more terrifying than simple predation. The most direct encounter came when Emma stumbled into a small clearing and found herself face to face with the massive creature that had been stalking her through the forest. The being stood over 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to shimmer with an almost metallic quality in the filtered sunlight, with eyes that held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. It studied her with the same intensity that she had been trying to use to study the forest, tilting its massive head as if trying to understand what kind of creature she was and what her intentions might be. The moment of eye contact lasted only seconds, but it left Emma with the chilling realization that she was being evaluated according to criteria she couldn't comprehend. The creature's expression seemed almost curious, as if it was encountering something as unusual to it as it was to her. Emma's attempt to slowly back away from the creature was met with a low vocalization that seemed to carry meaning, as if the being was trying to communicate something important or warn her about something she couldn't see. The sound was complex, with tonal variations that suggested it was part of a sophisticated language system, and Emma had the disturbing realization that the creature was actually trying to talk to her. When she continued to retreat, the creature's vocalizations became more insistent, and she could hear answering calls from the forest around her as other beings responded to what sounded like tactical coordination. The realization that she was surrounded by multiple intelligent creatures that were discussing her fate in a language she couldn't understand filled Emma with a terror that transcended anything she had ever experienced. The decision to run came when Emma heard the creatures beginning to move closer, their massive forms crashing through the underbrush with increasing boldness as they closed the distance between themselves and their subject. She turned and sprinted toward what she hoped was the direction of the main trail, her flight through the dark forest becoming a nightmare of stumbling over unseen obstacles and constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. The creature's response was immediate and coordinated, with sounds of movement that indicated they were not willing to let their subject escape without a significant effort to recapture her. Their pursuit began with what sounded almost like disappointment, as if they had hoped for a different outcome from their attempted communication. The chase through the forest revealed the true extent of the creature's physical capabilities as they moved through the dense woodland with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for beings of their size. Emma could hear them crashing through the trees behind her, their pursuit coordinated in ways that suggested they were working together to cut off her escape routes and funnel her toward a destination of their choosing. The sounds of their movement indicated that they were not simply chasing her, but were actively herding her, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to guide her flight along paths that would eventually lead her back into their control. Their footsteps thundered through the forest with a rhythm that suggested they were matching each other's pace, working as a coordinated unit rather than individual predators. During her desperate flight, Emma began to notice that the very forest seemed to be conspiring with her pursuers, creating obstacles that slowed her progress while providing clear pathways for the creatures that hunted her through the darkness. Branches caught at her clothing with deliberate precision. Roots shifted to trip her at crucial moments, and the terrain itself seemed to funnel her toward areas where her pursuers could more easily corner her. Most disturbing was the growing realization that the sounds of pursuit were becoming more organized and strategic, with different voices calling to each other in what sounded like tactical coordination. The creatures were communicating constantly during the chase, sharing information about her location and coordinating their movements with military precision. As Emma stumbled through the undergrowth, her panic-stricken mind began to process details that her terror had initially obscured, fragments of understanding that painted an even more disturbing picture of her situation. The creatures pursuing her seemed to be using tools. She could hear the distinctive sounds of implements striking wood and stone, suggesting they possessed technology that no wild animal should have been able to create or use. Their vocalizations carried nuances that indicated not just communication, but complex language, with tonal variations that suggested they were discussing strategy and coordinating their efforts with a sophistication that rivaled human military operations. The realization that she was being hunted by something that could think, plan, and use tools was more terrifying than any simple animal attack. The forest around Emma began to take on an increasingly surreal quality as her flight continued, with shadows that moved independently of any visible source and sounds that seemed to come from directions that defied the laws of physics. She found herself running through areas that her rational mind insisted couldn't exist. Clearings that were perfectly circular despite being surrounded by ancient trees, streams that flowed uphill, and rock formations that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The pursuit behind her continued relentlessly, accompanied by phenomena that suggested the very fabric of reality was being manipulated by forces beyond her comprehension. The creatures seemed to possess abilities that went beyond simple physical prowess, as if they could influence the environment itself to aid in their hunt. Emma's terror reached new heights when she realized that her pursuers seemed to be enjoying the chase, their calls carrying what could only be described as amusement, as if her panic was providing them with entertainment rather than simply serving a practical purpose. The creatures appeared to be toying with her, allowing her to think she was escaping, only to cut off her route and force her to change direction. Their superior knowledge of the terrain gave them an overwhelming advantage, and Emma began to understand that her flight was nothing more than another part of their experiment, a test of her responses under extreme stress rather than a genuine opportunity for freedom. The psychological warfare was as deliberate as their physical pursuit, designed to break down her resistance and force her into complete submission. At one point during the chase, Emma managed to climb a massive fallen tree that had created a natural bridge across a deep ravine, hoping to put some distance between herself and her pursuers. But as she reached the middle of the makeshift bridge, she heard the unmistakable sound of the creatures climbing up behind her with impossible agility. Their massive hands gripped the bark with ease, their powerful limbs propelling them up the trunk with a speed that defied their enormous size. Emma could hear their breathing growing closer, deep and rhythmic, like the sound of massive bellows. And she realized with growing horror that they were actually gaining on her, despite her head start. The creature's pursuit took on an almost playful quality, as they began to demonstrate abilities that seemed designed to showcase their superiority over their human prey. Emma watched in terror as one of the beings leaped from tree to tree with impossible grace, covering distances that should have been fatal for any creature of its size. Another seemed to be moving through the forest canopy above her, keeping pace with her desperate flight while remaining almost completely invisible among the dense foliage. The coordination between the creatures was so precise that Emma began to suspect they were communicating through methods she couldn't detect, perhaps using infrasonic frequencies or other signals that were beyond human perception. As Emma's energy waned, she stumbled into a clearing she didn't recognize, one that seemed impossibly ancient, the ground covered in spirals of stones and bones. The air was thick with the scent of moss and something musky, and the trees pressed in so tightly that the sky was only a memory. The creatures paused at the edge, watching her with a patience that felt almost ritualistic. For a moment, Emma felt as if she were the centerpiece of a ceremony, the subject of a gathering that had been waiting for her arrival for centuries. The largest of the beings stepped forward, raising its arms and letting out a guttural call that echoed through the trees, answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground vibrate beneath her feet. Suddenly, the spell was broken. The creatures turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone in the clearing. She didn't know if she had passed some kind of test or if they had simply lost interest, but she seized the opportunity to run. Branches whipped at her face, and roots threatened to trip her with every step, but she pushed on, driven by a primal fear that drowned out all rational thought. Behind her, she could still hear the creatures moving, their calls growing fainter as she put distance between them. But even as she escaped, Emma knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The breakthrough that would save Emma's life came when she stumbled into an area where her cell phone unexpectedly picked up a weak signal, allowing her to place a frantic call to emergency services while still running from her pursuers. The 911 recording captured her panicked description of being chased by creatures that defied rational explanation, beings that moved through the forest with intelligence and coordination that suggested advanced cognitive abilities. Her call was interrupted by sounds that the emergency operator later described as unlike anything in their experience. vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple sources and carried an unmistakable sense of intelligence and purpose. The creatures seemed to realize what she was doing and began calling to each other with increased urgency, as if debating whether to stop her communication or allow it to continue. Emma's call ended abruptly when her phone lost signal, but not before emergency responders had obtained her GPS coordinates and a recording that would become the subject of intense analysis and debate. The creatures pursuing her seemed to realize that outside help was coming, and their vocalizations took on a different quality, less playful and more urgent, as if they were debating whether to continue their pursuit or retreat deeper into the forest. Emma could hear them calling to each other in what sounded like rapid consultation, their massive forms still crashing through the trees behind her, but with less coordination than before. The change in their behavior suggested that they understood the implications of human authorities becoming involved in their activities. The sound of approaching helicopters seemed to trigger a fundamental change in the creatures' behavior, their pursuit becoming less aggressive as they apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Emma could still hear them moving through the forest around her, but they were no longer actively hurting her or trying to cut off her escape routes. Instead, they seemed to be withdrawing deeper into the wilderness, their vocalizations fading as they put distance between themselves and the approaching rescue operation. Emma's relief was tempered by the realization that her ordeal was far from over. She was still lost in a vast wilderness with creatures that could return at any moment if they decided the threat had passed. The creatures' withdrawal was not immediate or complete, as Emma continued to hear them moving through the forest around her for several more hours. They seemed to be maintaining surveillance of her position while staying far enough away to avoid detection by the search teams. Their vocalizations became more subdued but never stopped entirely, suggesting that they were continuing to communicate about her presence and the arrival of outside help. Emma had the disturbing realization that she was still being watched and evaluated, even as rescue teams worked to locate her position. The creature's ability to remain hidden while maintaining awareness of the situation demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that was deeply unsettling. As the search helicopters grew closer, Emma began to notice changes in the forest around her that suggested the creatures were actively working to conceal evidence of their presence. Footprints that had been clearly visible just hours before seemed to be disappearing, as if someone was deliberately obscuring the tracks. Equipment that had been scattered during her flight was being moved or hidden, and the paths through the forest that had seemed so clear during the chase were becoming increasingly difficult to follow. The creatures appeared to be conducting a systematic cleanup operation, removing any evidence that might confirm Emma's incredible story about what had happened in the wilderness. The search and rescue operation that followed Emma's emergency call revealed evidence that supported her incredible claims while raising new questions about what had actually occurred in those remote mountains. Rangers found massive footprints throughout the area where Emma had been chased, tracks that formed complex patterns suggesting coordinated movement by multiple large beings. Her camera equipment was discovered scattered throughout the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than random dropping, with memory cards that contained hours of footage showing glimpses of enormous figures moving through the trees with obvious intelligence and purpose. The equipment had been handled with care, as if the creatures understood its value and had deliberately preserved it for discovery. The footage recovered from Emma's cameras provided the most compelling evidence ever captured of intelligent non-human life in North American forests, showing clear images of bipedal creatures that stood over 8 feet tall and moved with coordination that indicated advanced cognitive abilities. The beings appeared to be deliberately positioning themselves to be recorded, as if they wanted their existence to be documented, but only under circumstances of their own choosing. Most remarkably, some sequences showed the creatures using what appeared to be primitive tools and communicating with each other through complex vocalizations that suggested a sophisticated language system. The footage also captured moments where the creatures seemed to be studying Emma's equipment with obvious scientific interest, manipulating her devices with a dexterity that suggested hands capable of fine motor control. Analysis of the recovered footage revealed details that investigators found deeply unsettling, particularly the way the creatures seemed to be conducting their own documentation of Emma's behavior and responses. Several sequences showed the beings using what appeared to be primitive recording devices of their own, crude but functional tools that suggested they were gathering their own evidence of the encounter for purposes that remained completely mysterious. The creatures' behavior indicated not just intelligence, but also scientific curiosity, as if they were conducting their own research project with Emma as the unwilling subject. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the footage had been edited or altered in ways that suggested the creatures possessed technical knowledge that exceeded what should have been possible for beings living in the wilderness. Emma was found 12 hours after her emergency call, discovered by search teams following the trail of broken vegetation and scattered equipment that marked her desperate flight through the forest. She was dehydrated and exhausted, but physically unharmed, though her mental state suggested she had experienced trauma that went far beyond simple fear of wild animals. Her account of being chased by multiple intelligent creatures was initially met with skepticism, but the physical evidence and recorded footage forced investigators to take her claims seriously. Most puzzling was her insistence that the creatures had deliberately allowed her to escape once they realized that outside help was coming, suggesting that their intelligence extended to understanding the broader implications of their actions. The evidence left behind after Emma's escape, strange tool marks, massive coordinated footprints, and her haunting footage, forced even the most skeptical rangers to admit she had encountered something far beyond a wild animal. The area was quietly restricted, and rumors spread of a hidden society in the forest. But Emma's story remained the only first-hand account. Her experience stands as a chilling warning. Some mysteries in the wild are not meant to be solved, and the silence of the forest may be watching, waiting for the next intruder. On October 15, 2023, Jessica was driving alone toward the Mount Baker area, roughly 90 miles northeast of Seattle. Her destination was a remote section of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, where she had been commissioned to investigate what her editor diplomatically called unusual wildlife reports. The dash cam footage begins with Jessica adjusting her rearview mirror and checking her equipment one final time before departing. Her voice, clear and professional, addresses the camera she's mounted on her dashboard, a habit she'd developed for documenting her fieldwork. Jessica recorded a brief field log before setting out toward the Baker area. She noted that the weather was clear and visibility would likely remain good for several hours. Her gear list included a telephoto lens, trail cameras, and enough provisions to stay out for up to 3 days if necessary. Before starting the drive, she paused, looking over a folder of ranger reports on the passenger seat. The documents described a series of unexplained incidents in the region, damaged equipment at research camps and large footprints discovered near survey sites that matched no known species native to the North Cascades. Jessica had never been drawn to cryptozoology. Her training made her skeptical of anything lacking empirical support. Yet these reports were hard to dismiss. They came not from fringe enthusiasts, but from people she respected, career rangers, wildlife biologists, and locals who had spent their entire lives in these mountains. She framed her investigation carefully in her notes, approaching the claims without bias and aiming to document an environmental cause or behavioral misidentification behind the sightings, never realizing that her search for reason would lead her straight into the inexplicable. She couldn't have known that by entering the Mount Baker wilderness, she would become part of the very mystery she'd set out to explain, or that the real question waiting in those woods wasn't what she'd find, but whether she'd return to tell it. The timestamp on Jessica's dashcam reads 2:31 p.m. as she merges onto State Route 20, the North Cascades Highway. The October afternoon light filters through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns of shadow and brightness across her windshield. The road winds steadily upward, following the natural contours of the mountainside. Jessica's commentary provides a steady narration as she drives, her voice relaxed and conversational. She notes the elevation, around 1,500 feet, and remarks that the area offers ideal habitat for black bears, cougars, and possibly even wolves migrating south from Canada. Halfway through the sentence, she pauses, glancing toward the tree line as though something had caught her eye. Then she resumes as if nothing happened. Her phone rings through the car's Bluetooth system. The caller ID shows her editor, Marcus. He's checking in before she heads too far into the backcountry, reminding her that she could bring assistance if she wanted. Jessica assures him she's fine, confident in her decade of experience handling difficult chutes and unpredictable terrain. Marcus doesn't sound reassured. He explains that local rangers have been filing unusual reports for months, equipment destroyed, campsites torn apart, and several hikers describing confrontations with something they couldn't identify. As he lists the incidents, Jessica's expression hardens, her attention shifting fully from the road to the implications of what he's saying. He describes witness accounts of a large, upright figure estimated at 7 to 8 feet tall, displaying aggressive, territorial behavior. One hiker claimed it hurled rocks from a distance. Another said it followed her through the forest for miles. There's a long silence between Marcus's words and Jessica's reply. She suggests that some of the reports might be attributed to misidentified primates, or maybe black bears, noting how they sometimes stand upright to survey their surroundings. Marcus concedes the point, but reminds her that the patterns don't align. Bears don't stalk people, and they certainly don't throw rocks with deliberate aim. Their conversation continues for several minutes as Marcus outlines more details from ranger logs. Outside the windshield, the dash cam records the deepening wilderness, the trees growing thicker and older, the road narrowing, and the distant peaks appearing through breaks in the forest, already powdered with early snow. At 2:47 p.m., Jessica notices the first anomaly. The radio begins to hiss with interference as she drives, filling the cabin with bursts of static broken by faint, low-frequency sounds that almost seem biological, like distant breathing or slow, rhythmic movement filtered through static. Marcus remains on the line, suggesting it's probably atmospheric interference caused by her elevation and distance from major transmitters, though there's an audible hesitation in his tone. Jessica continues adjusting the dial, scanning through frequencies. Most yield only static, but every so often she catches flickers of distant signals. Country music out of Spokane, a Vancouver news broadcast, fragments of Seattle talk radio. Later, aerial search records revealed that pilots who joined the search a week after her disappearance reported hearing that same radio static. She tells Marcus she'll check in again once she reaches the base camp area, estimating about an hour's drive remaining. He advises her to stay alert and to rely on instinct if anything feels wrong. When the call ends, Jessica is left with only the engine's hum and the intermittent crackle of the radio. The interference grows sharper, then fades entirely. She switches off the stereo, preferring the ambient rhythm of the forest, the whine of wind between trees, the muted percussion of gravel beneath her tires. Mile marker 47 sits at a sharp bend in the road where the highway curves around a massive granite outcropping. The dashcam timestamp shows 3:02 p.m. when Jessica first notices something unusual in the tree line to her right. She slows the vehicle, pulling onto a narrow shoulder barely wide enough for her SUV. The dashcam continues recording as she shifts into park, leaving the engine running. Through the windshield, the forest appears normal. Towering Douglas firs, thick undergrowth, the dappled light of late afternoon filtering through the canopy. But something catches Jessica's trained eye. A subtle movement, Something darker than shadow flickers between the trees about 30 yards from the road near a fallen log. She reaches for her binoculars, raising them slowly as the dashcam records her measured, deliberate motions. For nearly 2 minutes, she studies the spot in silence, adjusting focus, scanning for definition or movement. Then, just for a second, her hand trembles. Whatever she sees is enough to change her plan. After a moment's hesitation, she opens her door and steps out, intent on getting a closer look. Jessica exits the vehicle, leaving the driver's door open and the engine running. The dash cam now shows an empty driver's seat, the forest visible through the open door. Her footsteps can be heard moving away from the vehicle, accompanied by the sound of breaking twigs and rustling undergrowth. For 3 minutes and 17 seconds, the dash cam records only the empty interior of her SUV and the ambient sounds of the forest. Occasionally, Jessica's voice can be heard in the distance, though her words are indistinct. Then she returns, moving quickly, but not quite running. Jessica slides back into the driver's seat, slightly out of breath, her face lit by a mix of exhilaration and disbelief. She fumbles for her handheld camera, a professional-grade device she keeps for close documentation, and begins reviewing the images she's just taken. The dash cam records her reaction as she scrolls through the shots, pausing on one in particular, a massive footprint pressed deep into the soft earth beside a creek bed. Her notes, spoken aloud for the recording, are calm but precise. The print measures roughly 18 inches in length and 7 inches across at the ball of the foot, with 5 clear toe impressions. The depth indicates an extraordinary weight, possibly 400 pounds or more. The stride length between prints, about 4.5 feet, suggests a bipedal creature, standing 7 to 8 feet tall. Jessica studies the image again, her analytical instincts competing with a growing sense of awe. In the reflection of the window beside her, the forest seems to shift, branches moving where no wind should be. This is exactly the type of evidence she came for: quantifiable, photographic, and verifiable. Yet as she steadies her breathing, it's clear she's also likely realizing the weight of what such evidence might mean. Whatever left those prints wasn't human, and it wasn't far ahead. She makes a decision that, in hindsight, might have saved her life, at least temporarily. The dash cam records her calmly stating her plan. She will return to town, find a motel for the night, and come back in the morning better equipped and rested. Her tone is steady but edged with fatigue, the kind of practical resolve born from experience in the field. She organizes her notes, checks her gear one last time, and starts the engine. The dash cam captures her 3-point turn at the junction, the logging road disappearing behind them as she heads back down the mountain. The timestamp reads 4:15 p.m. as Jessica's SUV disappears around a bend in the road, heading back toward civilization. But watching the footage now, one can't help but ask, did something in those woods watch her leave? The dash cam timestamp reads 7:23 a.m., October 16th, 2023, as Jessica's SUV once again approaches the junction with Forest Service Road 3071. Jessica begins her second day of field work with a calm, methodical tone, her voice steady as she narrates to the dash cam. She notes that she has brought 3 trail cameras, motion sensors, audio recording equipment, and enough supplies for 2 days if needed. As she turns left onto the logging road, the smooth asphalt of the main highway gives way to rough gravel and dirt, and the dash cam begins to shake with the rhythm of each pothole. Consulting her GPS, Jessica remarks that the road runs about 12 miles into the national forest, and that most of the documented incidents took place between miles 4 and 8, a stretch the locals call Devil's Backbone Ridge. Her tone stays light, but there's a faint pause before she says the name, like she's only now realizing its weight. Driving deeper into the wilderness, the dashcam captures the gradual transformation of the landscape. The managed forest near the highway gives way to old-growth timber. Massive trees that have stood for centuries, their trunks so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. The undergrowth becomes denser, more primitive. At 7:47 a.m., Jessica's radio begins to experience the same interference she encountered the previous day. This time, however, the static is harsher, louder, more rhythmic, and seemingly intentional in its fluctuation. She remarks that the same issue has returned, but that it's noticeably stronger today. She cycles through multiple stations, searching for a clear signal. All she finds are fragments of distant broadcasts buried beneath the static, snatches of music, and clipped words. The low-frequency pulses rise and fall with an irregular cadence. At mile marker 4, Jessica encounters her first major obstacle. A large tree has fallen across the road, its massive trunk blocking any direct passage. The scene forces her to slow and assess. Thanks to decades of old logging work, she spots a narrow bypass road running parallel to the main path and carefully guides her vehicle along it. As she does, she comments on the tree's condition. The break appears fresh, clean, and without evidence of disease or decay. Something had to bring it down recently. Something strong. The dash cam records Jessica leaning toward the passenger window to examine the fallen tree. The trunk, nearly 4 feet in diameter, shows no clear reason for its collapse. Its exposed roots appear healthy, strong, and anchored deeply in the soil, suggesting that whatever caused the fall wasn't natural decay or weather. It would require enormous force to tear it from the ground. As she drives farther up the logging road, the terrain shifts. The neatly managed timber gives way to dense, untouched forest, a stretch of wilderness that likely hasn't seen human passage in months. The timestamp on the dashcam reads 8:15 a.m. when Jessica reaches mile 6, the section known as Devil's Backbone Ridge. Consulting her notes, she remarks that this is where most of the recent incidents have been reported. Her plan, she explains methodically, is to establish a small base camp and deploy her trail cameras in a perimeter around the site. Her voice stays steady, but she glances twice at her side mirror, as if something has caught her peripheral vision. Jessica parks in a natural clearing just off the road, surrounded by towering trees that blot out much of the morning light. When she cuts the engine, the quiet feels absolute, broken only by faint wind threading through the canopy and the distant hollow croak of a raven. She checks her phone and confirms that there's no signal, no bars, no data, no contact with the outside world. The realization settles in quietly. From this point on, she is completely alone. At 9:15 a.m., Jessica begins setting up her equipment. The dashcam continues recording as she moves in and out of frame, carrying cameras, tripods, and monitoring devices. She narrates into her handheld recorder as she moves through the site, documenting her setup methodically. Trail Camera 1 is positioned overlooking the main game trail, the most obvious route for large animals moving through the area. Camera 2 covers the narrow creek crossing where she had discovered the footprints the previous day. Camera 3 is placed to monitor the clearing marked by the splintered branches, a spot that still shows signs of recent disturbance. For a brief moment, one camera feed flickers as if reacting to motion, then stabilizes. By 11:30 a.m., Jessica has completed her setup and returns to her vehicle to monitor the feeds from her trail cameras. The dashcam captures her reviewing the live video streams on her laptop, occasionally making notes in a field journal. For nearly 4 hours, nothing happens. The trail cameras record the normal activities of forest wildlife, a few squirrels, a pair of ravens, a black-tailed deer that approaches one of the cameras before being startled away. But every so often, the ambient audio drops for a split second. Then at 3:47 p.m., everything changes. Jessica is reviewing footage from Trail Camera 2 when movement on the main road catches her attention. The dashcam captures her sudden alertness as something large crosses the logging road approximately 200 yards ahead of her position. She instinctively reaches for her binoculars, trying to focus on the shape moving between the trees. The figure is visible for only a few seconds before disappearing into the forest on the opposite side. But those few seconds are enough to confirm Jessica's worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. The creature is massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, with a broad, muscular build covered in dark, coarse hair. The treetops sway after it passes, though the air itself is still. She exhales sharply, realizing what she has just seen, a mixture of awe and terror running through her. It's real, everything she came here searching for. That realization seems to override caution. She grabs her handheld camera and exits the vehicle, leaving the engine running and the dashcam recording. This decision, to leave the safety of her SUV and pursue the creature on foot, will prove to be the beginning of the end. The dashcam shows an empty driver's seat, the forest visible through the open door. Jessica's voice drifts from deeper in the woods as she describes following a trail marked by broken branches and crushed vegetation. For several minutes, only her faint commentary and the quiet hum of the forest are audible, until at 3:52 p.m., her tone changes. She reports seeing something standing about 50 yards ahead, silent and motionless, watching her. Her voice lowers, trembling, as she estimates its height at nearly 8 feet, shoulders impossibly wide, arms hanging long past the waist. Then a new sound enters the audio feed, a deep, guttural vocalization unlike any known wildlife call. These sounds were later found to be consistent with communication between multiple large primates, possibly coordinating some kind of group activity. If true, how long had they been there? Listening, waiting, learning? At 3:57 p.m., the situation collapses. A roar erupts, powerful enough to distort the dashcam's audio. Jessica's scream follows, then the chaotic sounds of pursuit, crashing brush, pounding footsteps. Moments later, the camera captures her sprinting from the trees, terrified, pursued by a massive dark shape. She throws herself into the SUV, slams the door, and starts the engine. Through the rear window, the creature is briefly visible, tall, broad, and unmistakably hostile. At 4:01 p.m., Jessica drives at reckless speed down the logging road, the dashcam shaking violently with each bump. Her voice is tight and breathless as she describes something large keeping pace in the tree line. Something hits the side mirror. It snaps back, but she doesn't stop. Was that a branch or something else? Later commentary by wildlife biologist Dr. James Thornton identified parallels with earlier wilderness disappearances, suggesting an escalation from defensive to predatory behavior. These creatures, he warned, were not merely protecting territory, they were hunting. Then, at 4:04 p.m., the front tire strikes a sharp rock. The blow causes the SUV to swerve violently as air hisses from the puncture. She fights to maintain control, but the deflating tire drags her toward the ditch. By 4:07 p.m., the vehicle is barely drivable. The creature moves closer now, visible in short bursts as it shadows her from the woods. When the tire finally gives out, Jessica stops on a narrow shoulder. Her satellite phone shows no signal. At 4:09 p.m., she decides to abandon the vehicle. She packs essential gear, secures the memory cards, and leaves toward the main road. The dashcam records her calm but strained voice explaining her plan before she disappears down the logging road. Her last words, directed at the camera, is a farewell to her family. The SUV remains still as the timestamp advances: 4:15 p.m., 4:16 p.m., 4:17 p.m. At 4:18 p.m., movement stirs behind it. The dashcam keeps recording as the light fades and the forest grows unnaturally quiet. By 4:33 p.m., the silence is broken by distant cries. Jessica's voice calling for help. At 4:35 p.m., the forest falls silent again. The dash cam continues to record the empty road, its lens fixed on the stillness that follows. This time, the silence doesn't break. However, an audio analysis later revealed that the apparent silence following Jessica's last scream was not truly silent. Using advanced filtering techniques, they isolated sounds below the normal range of human hearing, infrasonic frequencies suggesting large animals moving through the forest. Slow, deliberate movements from multiple sources. At 5:50 p.m., as shadows begin to lengthen across the logging road, something extraordinary happens. The dash cam captures a figure emerging from the forest, not the massive creature that had been hunting Jessica, but Jessica herself. She appears at the edge of the camera's field of view, moving slowly and unevenly toward her SUV. Something is clearly wrong. Jessica's posture is hunched, her left arm pressed tightly against her torso as if to stem bleeding. Her clothes are torn and smeared with dirt, and dark stains spread across her shirt and jacket. Her right leg drags slightly with each step, suggesting an injury severe enough to impair her movement. When she reaches the vehicle, the dash cam captures her leaning heavily against the door for support before pulling it open. She breathes in short, shallow bursts, clearly in pain, but remains focused. Despite her condition, her actions are deliberate. She rummages through her gear, removing memory cards from her cameras and checking each one as though verifying what's been recorded. There's no sign of panic in her expression now, only exhaustion and grim determination. Her face is pale, streaked with dirt and blood, and her hands shake from either pain or shock. Still, she continues working, hiding 3 memory cards in specific places around the SUV. One taped under the dashboard, another wedged behind the spare tire, and a third inside the first aid kit. The fourth, containing the most recent footage, she keeps with her handheld camera. At 5:54 p.m., Jessica speaks for the last time. Her voice is weak but steady as she says that someone needs to know what's happening here. Someone has to understand. She closes the SUV door, steadies herself against it for a moment, then turns toward the forest once more. Limping heavily, she disappears into the trees, leaving the dash cam recording the empty clearing behind her. A low, distant thud follows a few seconds later, something heavy hitting the ground. Then, silence again. Afterward, Jessica closes the SUV door and turns toward the trees. At 5:57 p.m., the dash cam records her final movements, walking with a strangely rigid gait, heading straight into the darkest part of the forest until she disappears from view. The dash cam continues recording, its battery slowly draining as the hours pass. The timestamp advances through the evening, 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 8 p.m. Darkness falls over the forest, and the camera's night vision mode activates, casting everything in an eerie green glow. Tiny glints, like eyeshine, appear at the edge of the frame, then vanish when the wind stirs. At 11:23 p.m., the dash cam captures its final significant footage. Something large moves through the trees behind the abandoned SUV, a massive bipedal figure that pauses at the edge of the clearing. For nearly 30 seconds, the creature stands motionless, as if studying the abandoned vehicle. Then it turns and disappears back into the forest. Before it's gone, the camera catches a brief reflection, metal, not fur, flashing on its arm. A tool or something taken from her gear? The dash cam continues recording until 3:47 a.m. on October 18th, when its battery finally dies. The screen goes black, ending 73 hours of continuous documentation that would later become crucial evidence in one of the Pacific Northwest's most disturbing missing person cases. October 20th, 2023 dawned clear and cold in the Mount Baker wilderness. Jessica Marcial had been missing for 4 days, and the search effort coordinated by the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office after being alerted by her editor. The search teams had been working systematically through the area where Jessica's cell phone had last pinged a tower, But the rugged terrain and dense forest made progress slow and dangerous. It was volunteer searcher Mike Rodriguez, a local hunting guide familiar with the logging roads, who finally located Jessica's abandoned SUV. Rodriguez immediately contacted the sheriff's office using his satellite radio, and within 2 hours, the abandoned SUV was surrounded by investigators and search teams. The dash cam was still in place, its battery dead, but its memory card intact. Jessica's professional camera equipment was present and undamaged. Her personal belongings, wallet, identification, spare clothes, were all accounted for. They also found 3 memory cards containing additional footage and photographs. The contents of these memory cards would provide the most disturbing evidence yet of what Jessica encountered in the Mount Baker wilderness. The 3 cards recovered from her SUV contained 14 hours of footage and nearly 800 photographs, all of which were immediately secured for analysis. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a cryptozoologist at the University of Washington, concluded that Jessica had documented multiple unknown primate-like creatures, highly intelligent, social, and coordinated. Footage showed at least 3 individuals, the largest around 8.5 feet tall, communicating through gestures and organized vocal patterns. Their movements suggested deliberate hunting strategy and environmental manipulation far beyond known primate behavior. When the footage was leaked to several online archives in early 2024, reaction was swift and polarized. Cryptid researchers hailed it as the most significant evidence of non-human primates in North America. Others, including prominent wildlife biologists and visual effects analysts, accused the leak of being part of a viral campaign, though no production company has ever claimed responsibility. Critics from a film review board noted the rawness of the footage: unsteady framing, ambient noise, no apparent cuts, and questioned how a hoax could sustain such realism without post-production. A forensic imaging report found no signs of digital manipulation, though it stopped short of confirming authenticity. For 6 days, the search teams immediately expanded their efforts, using Jessica's SUV as a base of operations. Search dogs were brought in to try to track her scent, but the results were confusing and contradictory. The handlers exchanged uneasy looks. How could one scent split 3 ways? The dogs picked up Jessica's scent leading away from the vehicle in multiple directions, but the trails didn't make sense. They would start strong, then fade completely, then reappear hundreds of yards away with no connecting path. It was like she had been carried through the air between scent points. The helicopter searches proved equally frustrating. Despite covering over 200 square miles of wilderness, the aerial teams found no trace of Jessica or any signs of her passage through the forest. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, the official search and rescue operation was suspended. However, federal teams still continue covert operations, searching for the concealed settlement seen in Jessica's footage. No official statement has been made, but at night, hikers along the mountain's edge still report the same low-frequency hum captured on her final recording. My name is Candace, and I went through the horrific experience of being stalked by Bigfoot all the way to my house. But once we reached my home, the Sasquatch tried to communicate with me, and what it told me is a truth so shocking it proves every Bigfoot expert's theories wrong. I was a wildlife field researcher, backcountry, high elevation, Pacific Northwest corridor, camera monitoring, species documentation, habitat assessment, 22 years of it. I was the person at the trailhead briefing who told weekend hikers that no, what they saw was probably a black bear, and here is a brochure. I was the person who changed the subject when someone brought up Sasquatch at a field dinner. I was skeptical in the way that people who know what's actually out there are skeptical, not dismissively, but with the weight of 2 decades of evidence behind the dismissal. I am telling you this so you understand exactly how far what I'm about to describe traveled to reach me. It was early April, 3 weeks past snowmelt. I was running a solo camera check through the lower drainage corridor, 12 cameras, a 4-hour loop I had walked so many times it felt like moving through my own house. I knew every blowdown, every ice patch, every place the creek went loud around the bend. I was alone, the way I was almost always alone out there. I smelled it first, not a bear. Bear is immediate. You know it the way you know coffee, instant and categorical. This was something I had no file for. Heavy, organic, closer to something familiar than anything I could name, but not quite arriving there. The smell of something large that had been somewhere wet and dark and ancient. I stopped walking, hand to my radio, weight back on my left foot. The drainage was quiet, too quiet. And I want to be careful when I say that because too quiet is the kind of thing people say in ghost stories, and I am not telling a ghost story. I'm telling you what I observed. The birds had stopped. The creek was the only sound. And underneath the creek, something else. A low displacement of air, the way the atmosphere changes when something with significant mass is nearby and not moving. I turned my head slowly. 40 feet off the trail, under a fallen cedar, in the depression the root ball had torn open when the tree came down, something was there. My first read was bear. The size was close. The low light coloring was close. I held that for maybe 3 seconds. Then the details came in. The arm, not a limb, an arm, folded underneath the head the way a person folds an arm when they sleep. Fingers at the edge of the depression, curled, too long for any bear I had ever documented. The shoulder width to torso ratio was wrong. The hair, where it caught the light, was growing in a direction that looked organized, along a grain, intentional, not the wild growth pattern of any animal in my catalog. I stood there long enough for the cold to settle into my forearms. And then it woke up, not the startled lurch of an animal surprised in sleep. The breathing changed first, a deliberate shift, like something running a quiet calculation underneath the surface. The posture adjusted, just slightly, and then the eyes opened. They found my face immediately. Not a scan, not the fractional second sweep you get from a deer or a bear registering a stimulus, directly to my face, which meant it had already located me before it opened its eyes, had known I was standing there, had been deciding what to do about it, and the opening of the eyes was simply the last step in a conclusion already reached. I have never been able to say what happened in that first second of eye contact without sounding like I'm reaching for something. So I'm going to say it the plainest way I know. It knew I was a person, and it was deciding what that meant. Not threat, not prey, something more complicated than either. It was injured, right shoulder compensating, fur matted along that side in the pattern a wound makes. A bad fall, probably. The granite above that drainage gets a coat of ice under the snowmelt, and it'll drop you fast. I made a decision, not a reasoned one. The kind that happens before reasoning catches up. I sat down, cross-legged, on the wet April ground. Not close enough to crowd it, not far enough to signal I was leaving. Just present, stopped, here. It watched me for 20 minutes. I did not move. Then it shifted its injured shoulder toward the wall of the depression and went back to sleep. I sat there for another hour to make sure. Then I walked back to my truck in the dark with the cold in my bones and something I could not name sitting in the middle of my chest, and I drove home. I should have filed a report. I should have called someone. Instead, I went back the next morning before dawn, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. I left food at the edge of the depression on the third morning. Nuts, dried fruit, the dense trail bars I carried on long checks. I put them down and walked back to my distance, and I watched it decide. That took 40 minutes. The approach took another 15, one body length at a time, long, deliberate pauses, a quality of movement I had never seen in any animal, not sneaking, not cautious exactly, but considered. Like each step was a sentence, it ate everything. Then it went back to its side of the depression, and it looked at me. Within a week, it was taking food from my hand. I am going to say that again so it lands properly. A Bigfoot, taking food from my open hand. The grip of its fingers around mine, warm, strong, held back from what I could already sense was a fraction of its actual range. My hand registered the data before my brain did, and then the brain caught up, and I had to work very hard to keep still. I had been sitting in that drainage every morning for 9 days. I had documented a lot of things in 22 years. I had never documented anything like this. On the 10th day, it put its hand on my knee while it ate and didn't move it until it was done. Its hand was larger than mine. I noticed that in my notes, the same way, I would note a track measurement. Clinical. The number mattered. The implication of the number was something I put aside for later. I was not ready to stop being a researcher yet. I walked back to my truck on the 31st morning, the regular loop, the regular check, the regular 2 miles of trail back to the trailhead. Nothing out of the ordinary. I drove the access road. I parked. I went inside and started the coffee. I heard the porch creak. I know every sound that porch makes. I have lived in that ranger station residence for 7 years alone, and I know which board holds for the mail carrier and which one shifts under the weight of my neighbor's dog. I know the sound of wind on the railing versus weight on the boards. This was weight. I opened the door. It was sitting on the northeast corner of the porch with its knees pulled up and its injured shoulder toward the wall. The same posture it had held in the depression, protecting the wound out of habit, the way a body holds a shape even after the immediate need has passed. It looked at me. It was not asking for anything. It had made a decision and was in the process of carrying it out. I stood in the doorway for what was probably 30 seconds. Then I left the door open, went back to the coffee, and stood at the kitchen window and watched the ravens in the meadow. I am a scientist. I am trained in observation and documentation. What I was observing was a Bigfoot sitting on my porch, and my documentation of that moment was, "Do not spook it." It came inside 20 minutes later. I know what that sentence sounds like. I know the version of this that gets told as a punchline. The wildlife researcher who brought a Bigfoot home. I have told that punchline myself about other people. I am not laughing now. I am the person who found a widened door frame necessary, who rearranged furniture without fully admitting to herself why, who stocked the kitchen differently and told no one, and kept going to work and running camera checks and filing reports that did not mention any of this. It stayed. It did not have a name until I gave it one. I did not call it Bigfoot. I did not call it Sasquatch. Those words belong to a category of argument, of blurry photographs and contested casts and people shouting at each other in comment sections. What was occupying my back room and eating the food I put out was not an argument. It was a living thing in my care. I named it Caleb. He answered to it within the week, not the way a dog comes to its name, the way a person does. A lift of the head, a quality of attention, a recognition that the sound was addressed to him specifically. I told myself I was documenting a behavior. I was lying to myself. I was talking to him across the kitchen table, and I knew it. He healed fast, faster than the wound had any business healing. Within 3 weeks, the shoulder compensation was gone. Within a month, he was moving through the property with a certainty that told me he had mapped every inch of it. He also mapped me. He learned my schedule before I noticed he was tracking it. He knew when I left and when I came back and what the difference in my movement meant about what kind of day it had been. He knew what the sound of the truck on the access road meant versus the sound of it at the trailhead. He knew what I looked like when I was tired and what I looked like when I was unsettled, and he responded to both differently. This is the part I want you to hold on to because it matters for what comes next. He was not just surviving in my proximity, he was paying attention to me. I started going back to the drainage with him about 3 weeks after he'd healed, not because I planned to. It happened the way things happen when two beings share a space and the rhythms line up. I headed out for the morning check, and he was at the trailhead when I got there, not waiting, already oriented toward the corridor, already in the mode I had come to recognize as field mode. We walked together. He knew the corridor better than I did, not in the way I knew it, not through documentation and named sections and protocol. He knew it from the inside. He knew which sections of creek held what and when. He knew the camera positions better than I had taught them to him, which meant he had been watching me work before I was aware he was watching. This is what I mean about him paying attention. There is a particular way he moved when he was receiving information from the terrain, a quality of stillness I had never seen in an animal or a person, a 20-minute suspension of everything that wasn't listening. The first time I matched it, standing beside him at a creek margin until the sounds restructured themselves around me, I understood that I had been moving through this country like I was reading a book by glancing at the headings. He taught me to read the whole page. I was not thinking about any of that in the morning. things changed. I was thinking about the light, that particular low lateral April light that makes wet road surfaces throw back a cold glare and makes the meadow grass look lit from underneath. He was walking the road shoulder the way he always did, not hiding exactly, but keeping to the margin. The habit of something that understands the center of things is not always where it belongs. I noticed the habit that morning the way you sometimes notice something you've seen 1,000 times, and suddenly it hits you differently. There was a grace in it, a calibration. The same attention he brought to everything, expressed in something as small as which side of a road he walked on. I don't know why it struck me so hard right then. I think now that I was meant to see it before I lost it. Something was off in him from the first step. I want to be careful here because it's easy to backfill signs after the fact. What I observed accurately was this. His attention was oriented outward and prior, not reactive, not tracking something specific, more like someone who has already received news and is living in the few seconds before they've processed what it means. He was tuned to a frequency I couldn't hear. He was listening for something before there was anything to hear. We crossed the creek at the ford, water high with snowmelt, cold, moving fast. He went downstream to manage the depth. I used the stepping stones, standard. We came together on the far bank and turned northeast into the drainage, and that is when the sound came, from the ridgeline to the north. I have spent 22 years cataloging the sounds this terrain makes, and I can tell you with certainty what that sound was not. It was not a tree. It was not a rockfall. It was not any animal in my documentation. It was percussion. Single impact, deliberate, the sound of something solid brought down against something else solid with intention behind it. Low register. It happened once, paused 3 or 4 seconds. Happened again, then stopped. I know wood knocking. Researchers in this field argue about it constantly. What it means, whether it's real communication or territorial display or coincidence. I had always been on the skeptical side of that argument. I had written a note in a field report 3 years earlier dismissing a colleague's wood-knocking observation as likely deadfall. I had used the word likely with the confidence of someone who had never actually heard the real thing. I stopped being skeptical the moment I heard it and watched what happened to Caleb. He stopped walking. Every stop he had ever made in the field had been a response to something real, something I would subsequently hear or see or smell once my slower processing caught up with his. His stops were never precautions. They were receipts. He was oriented toward the ridgeline with the fixed, complete attention of something that has found what it was looking for, not searching, already there. And then he made a sound I had never heard him make. In all the weeks of living alongside him, I had cataloged his sounds the way I catalog everything, the low exhale of ease, the staccato click of focused interest, the 2 times I heard the long dropping vocalization that meant he was truly frightened. I had what I thought was a complete inventory. I did not have this. What came out of him in that creek bottom was structured in a way that animal vocalizations are not structured. It had a beginning and a shape and an ending that was not the shape of a feeling being released. The ending was chosen. There was intention behind the architecture of it, the same way there is intention behind the architecture of a sentence. He was not expressing a state. He was saying something, and from the ridgeline, something said something back. Same register, different pattern. A response. The way a response is structurally different from an initiation. It assumes the first thing, it builds on it, it implies a shared context. And then a silence that felt the way silence feels after a conversation ends, not before one begins. I am a researcher. My first instinct in that moment was to reach for my recorder. My second instinct, arriving about half a second later, was the one I should have been paying attention to. There were others. There had always been others in this corridor. He had always known they were there. This had not been a secret. A secret requires a choice to conceal, and he had never once given me the impression he was concealing anything. It had simply existed below my frequency range. I had been standing next to him for weeks while he lived in a world that was larger than the one I could perceive, and this morning a piece of that world had come close enough to reach me. He looked at me, back and forth, my face, the ridgeline, my face, the ridgeline. 15 seconds. Inside those 15 seconds, I watched something move through him that I recognized even though I had never seen it in him before. the particular quality of a decision that has already been made and is now being held for one more moment before it executes. He put his hand on my shoulder. He had done it before, dozens of times. A gesture I knew, part of the physical vocabulary we had built together over weeks of shared terrain. But the quality of it was different in the way that the same word said at the wrong moment suddenly means something else entirely. It was deliberate, attended, the contact of something that knows it is about to cross a line and is making the contact count, and then the hand tightened, not steadying, not directing. Something underneath all the calibrated, managed contact of the previous weeks came forward. Something older than the Caleb I knew. Something the ridgeline had called up. I did not have time to understand what was coming. The force was not something I had a referent for. I have watched him move down timber that would have needed a crew and equipment. I have cataloged that strength from a professional distance as data without ever receiving it as something that could be applied to my body. That morning, it was applied to my body. I went down hard against the root mass at the drainage's edge, 20 feet from where I had been standing, with no memory of the transit. The air left my lungs in a single compression. The back of my skull met the root mass, and the world went white and came back sharp. The specific sharpness of a mind that has understood it is in danger. He was standing over me, full height, not adjusted, not compressed for proximity or door frames or the dimensions of my kitchen. All of him, at once, for the first time. I want to try to give you the scale of this accurately, because this is the part where Bigfoot stops being a word and becomes a fact. The height of him above me was not the height of a large man. It was the height of a landscape feature. He blocked the April sky. The width of him against the tree line, I could see the tree line to his left, and it did not reach his shoulder. I had been living with this. I had been handing this creature trail mix across my kitchen counter. I had named it and talked to it and walked 12 miles of mountain terrain with it, and I had never until this moment seen all of it at the same time. His face was the same face I knew. That was the worst part. Not that it was monstrous. It wasn't. The features were the features I could have identified across a drainage, but everything I had spent weeks reading as familiar had been stripped out of them. Not anger, not aggression, something underneath all of that, something that had been present in him below everything I knew of him, and the ridgeline had called it up. He brought one arm across my chest. I did not lose consciousness. I want to be clear about that, because passing out would have been a mercy, and the morning did not offer mercy. I was present for every second of what followed. The weight of that arm was precise, not the weight of something out of control. The measured weight of a thing that knew exactly how much it was applying and had chosen that amount for a reason. He made a sound above me, not the language from the ridgeline, not any sound from my catalog. This came from somewhere below communication, below expression, the sound of something under enormous pressure, releasing a fraction of that pressure into the air, involuntary, geological. The sound of depth the surface had not been advertising. I did not speak. I did not move. Not a choice. There was no moment in which choices were available. The same instinct that had made me sit down in the mud beside him that first morning was running now. Stillness, complete and offered. The only thing I had, given without reservation. I don't know how long he stood over me. The creek ran. The April light moved across the drainage at its ordinary pace. The world did not pause. Then the arm lifted. Gone as suddenly as it had arrived. He stepped back. I waited until I was certain the stillness was a choice and not a necessity. Then I turned my head. He was at the drainage margin, back partially toward me, but the angle of his body still held an awareness of me. I was still information he was receiving, still part of his accounting, and he was enormous, even at 40 feet, even at the margin. The tree line to his left didn't reach his shoulder. I was looking at something that I had been referring to with a name, feeding with my hands, walking trails with. And I was only now lying in April mud with what I would later confirm were 3 cracked ribs, receiving the full fact of what it was. Not Caleb, the creature I'd been housing, not a damaged juvenile that had followed a field researcher home, something that belonged to the ridgeline the way the ridgeline belonged to itself, something old and enormous and only partly knowable and fully, completely real. Then he started up the slope, the unhurried pace he used when he was moving toward something with full intention behind it. No looking back. The firs took him in the way the mountains take things. No ceremony, no gap in the canopy, just present and then not. The creek kept running. I lay there for a long time. The physical damage, 3 cracked ribs, a scalp laceration that bled through my collar on the walkout, a bruise across my chest that would develop over the following days into something I have no parallel for in 22 years of fieldwork. The pressure pattern was readable. precise, the record of a force that had a different outcome available to it and did not take it. He could have killed me. I lay in the drainage with 3 cracked ribs and thought about that. Not with fear. The fear had already moved through me while it was happening. What I was left with was something else. He could have killed me. He had chosen exactly the amount of force the communication required. No more. I got up using the root mass and walked back to the ford. The water was cold and fast. I crossed it and turned on the far bank, empty. Above the timberline, somewhere on the ridgeline, there were sounds that belonged to a ECE conversation I was not part of. I walked home. He did not come back that night, or the next, or the one after that. The porch was quiet in a way it hadn't been since before he arrived. My dog, a cattle mix named Roper, went to the corner of the porch every morning where his weight had worn the board a particular way and lay down there and listened, and after a while came back inside. She was not doing that for me. Animals hold vigil at frequencies I can't access. I sat at my kitchen table on the 4th night with coffee that went cold and looked at the widened doorframe and the rearranged furniture and the dents in the backroom floor that held the shape of something large that had slept there for weeks. I had spent 22 years documenting the wild from a professional distance, and I had let that distance collapse completely. And now I was sitting alone in a ranger station residence that still smelled faintly of something the field guides had no entry for. I went back to the drainage 4 days later. Prints at the creek margin. Fresh, clean edges, dew still in the surrounding grass. Large, his. He had come back to the corridor. He was just not coming back to me. I went back a week after that. Prints at the ford, pressed deep into the soft bank. The stride length and toe spread unmistakable. I know his tracks the way I know his face. These were his. He was in the country, moving through it, moving through the drainage we had walked together, moving past the cameras he had known the positions of since the first week, and showing up on not a single frame of footage. 12 cameras, 7 visits over the following month. Not one image. He knew where they were. He had always known. He moves around them the way you move around the furniture in a room you know by heart. He is not hiding from me. He is simply not available to be found the way people look for Bigfoot, with cameras and bait and the assumption that it doesn't know you're looking. He knows. There is a photograph in my desk drawer. I took it during the 3rd week when he had started accompanying me on the morning checks. He is standing at the edge of the bench drainage where the tree line opens, and you can see the ridge line to the north. His back is to the camera. He is looking at something far away, his weight settled in that particular stillness of his, arms close to his sides. You can see his height against the tree line. You can see that the tree line does not reach his shoulder. That photograph is the only proof I have, and I have never shown it to anyone. Not because I don't want to be believed, because the photograph is mine, because what it holds, the scale of him, the stillness, the ridgeline in the background, is not something I am ready to hand to an argument. I have spent a lot of time since then sitting with what happened at the root mass. I think the force was the message. I know that sounds like I am trying to make something brutal into something meaningful, and I understand why it sounds that way. But I have examined this with the same precision I bring to everything I document, and this is what the evidence says. He used exactly as much force as the communication required, not more. He had significantly more available, and he did not use it. What he applied was measured, chosen, specific. He needed me to know at full scale what he was, not the version that moved through my kitchen, not the version that accepted food from my open hand, the actual version, the full dimensions. He needed me to have that before he left, and the only way to give me the full dimensions of a thing is to let it act at full capacity. Not a farewell, not punishment, a fact, the most accurate and complete fact he knew how to give me. He looked at me, back and forth, my face to the ridgeline, 15 seconds, holding the before and after in the same hand for as long as both would fit. And then he gave me the truth of what he was, at exactly the force the truth required, and he walked toward the sound of his own people calling from the ridge. I am still walking the corridor. I still find his sign, still fresh every time. He is moving through the drainage constantly, more active than anything my cameras have ever captured, covering ground that would exhaust a human crew in a day. He lives in this terrain the way the terrain lives in itself, completely, without effort. He knows I am there. He has always known when I'm there. And some mornings, not every morning, not on any schedule, I come to the creek margin and I do what he taught me to do. I stop moving. I stop scanning. I stand completely still and I open to whatever frequency I can reach, and I stay there for 20 minutes in the silence. I heard something answer once, not close, not from the drainage, from somewhere up on the ridgeline, above the tree line, in a direction I could not identify with precision. A structured sound, the same architecture I had heard in the creek bottom the morning everything changed. A beginning and a shape and a chosen ending. Not an animal, not the terrain, not any of the 2 decades of cataloged sounds I carry in my head. The same register he used when he spoke to whatever was on that ridgeline. I did not have my recorder. I stood very still, and I listened to it, and I felt something. I am not going to dress up in scientific language because it would not survive the translation. I felt located. I felt that something on that ridge knew exactly where I was standing and had chosen specifically to let me hear it. I have not heard it again, but I go back. Every morning I go back to the ford, and I look at the far bank, and I stand in silence. I take 20 minutes of complete stillness, and I give them to whatever is in the frequency above mine. And some mornings, the silence has a quality that the silence before it did not have. People spend their entire lives looking for Bigfoot, setting up cameras and casts and thermal rigs, and arguing on forums about what the footage shows. I have had 17 field visits since the birthday, 12 sets of fresh prints, not one frame of footage, and one sound from a ridgeline that I heard with my own ears and cannot prove. And I have a board on a porch that still holds the particular compression of a weight that sat there every morning for weeks. That's what I have. That's what I'm giving you. The far bank is empty every time I turn around at the ford. I keep turning around.